Those who can't pay the rent during COVID-19 have been protected from eviction, but that won't last forever. What happens when that bill comes due? Climate change hasn't gone away. In fact, it's only getting worse. Now those with deep pockets are getting worried. And hello, Gen Z, the new podcast taking a deep dive into a generation poised to change what it means to be American. I'm Mark Sauer, and the KPBS Roundtable starts now.
¿Qué onda, friends? In this episode of Port of Entry, we wanted to share the live event experience we hosted together last year as part of the World Design Experience with special guests Charles Glaubitz and Giancarlo Ruiz. You don't want to miss this two-part episode of our live event. Catch us wherever you get your podcasts. Nos vemos pronto.
Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer. And joining me at the KPBS Remote Roundtable today, reporter Max Rivlin-Nadler of KPBS News, podcast hosts Abby Hamlin and Christy Totten of the San Diego Union-Tribune, and Michael Smolens, columnist with the Union-Tribune. We've wrapped up another month living with COVID-19, and the pandemic shows no sign of slowing down. San Diego has seen a string of days with record-breaking case numbers. Deaths are approaching 600, and contact tracers, a key element in limiting the spread, can hardly keep up. Then there's the economic toll. Unemployment benefits are drying up, and another rent payment is due for many this weekend. Joining us is KPBS reporter Max Rivlin-Nadler, who just had an in-depth report on the looming rent crisis. Max, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, this week, the San Diego City Council began work to push back the rent payment period to the end of the year. As you worked in your latest story, are you able to grasp just how widespread the problem is?
It's a true crisis. Right now, a consulting firm found that just over 40% of California's renters currently are unable to pay rent and are at threat of eviction if these eviction moratoriums were to be lifted anytime soon. So that's California as a whole. In terms of San Diego, we already know it has elevated rents. It's had an affordability crisis for over a decade right now. So we can imagine, we don't have statistics, but we can imagine that people are especially rent burdened right now in San Diego.
And San Diego is already an expensive place to live. We already have a long-standing housing crisis here, long before COVID-19 came along. How has the economic fallout deepened that divide?
Right. It's hit San Diego's industries especially hard. We have a huge tourism industry, a huge hospitality industry, a very lively restaurant scene. So a lot of people who worked in those industries were tenants, were younger people, were people from communities that were climbing the economic ladder through the service industry. So it's been pretty devastating. People have not been able to go back to work. And again, with those unemployment benefits expiring, you're seeing people now who already were having trouble keeping up with their rent really face kind of an impossible situation.
And eviction moratoriums mean people at least have peace of mind knowing they won't be on the streets immediately. Who's covered by these moratoriums?
So each municipality in San Diego County has enacted, for the most part, their own moratorium. They've all expired at different times or are set to expire at different times. The one covering the entire county already expired at the beginning of July, but had built into that it would be 90 days before that any eviction action could be taken. And of course, this is all being essentially put on hold by the state's judicial council, which is not allowing eviction proceedings that would stem from, I believe, March 14th onward to move forward. So right now, everything's on hold, but the judicial council has said that on August 14th, they're going to revisit that with the idea that they're probably going to lift it. And the reason why they've telegraphed that, the chief judge has said in only so many words, that they want the legislature to act. They want something to be done for these tenants and these landlords, and the courts can't be held off indefinitely.
Right. We should note the landlords, there may be a stereotype of big, rich landlords, but a lot of them really rely on this income just as the employees do, and their consumers, their taxpayers, they shouldn't really be left holding the bag either, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is the myth of the small landlord. It's or the idea of the small landlord. A lot of them are not very small, and a lot of these people, who get held up as kind of these nest egg landlords. There are people for sure who do that, but a lot of these individuals have, over 100 properties. Those are the people who, basically are able to kind of throw their economic weight around. It's those middle landlords who maybe own, 20 to 100 properties who have actually gotten on board with some efforts to keep these moratoriums or these repayment plans, delayed repayment plans in place to allow tenants to really find a space and support to repay them, because it does not help you to evict tenants. It is a hard situation. And in this current market, it's not easy to refill those apartments.
Right. Now, if people aren't paying, they need to catch up eventually. Is there any chance of rent and mortgage forgiveness on the horizon?
That's being discussed right now in the state legislature, because as we saw with Senate recessing, that it's not coming from the federal level. So it's got to come from the state level. They're working on a couple of bills right now. One of those bills is AB 1432, which was sponsored by Bay Area Assemblyman David Hsu. And that would essentially kind of kick the can down the road a little bit and allow people well into 2022 possibly to continue stretching out their payments, coming to deals with landlords, and taking away evictions as a method to deal with non-payment, right? Because the catastrophe that California wants to avoid is adding to its homelessness crisis. So what they want to do is basically take the eviction claim, the eviction process, and move it to small claims court. If tenants don't have the money that you owe them from during the pandemic, you could work it out at small claims court, but it won't end up with the tenant out on the street.
Yeah, that's the last thing anybody would want, is any more exacerbation of the homeless crisis. Well, I wanted to shift gears a bit. You had a busy week reporting on COVID-19. Another story looked at young people trying to dispel some myths about the virus. What are some of those myths?
Well, they're being popped every day, but for a while it was the idea that young people don't feel the impacts of COVID-19, that they barely even feel it, that they get over it. And of course, there are asymptomatic people who end up testing positive, but there are also people who suffer lifelong issues because of COVID-19, or at least, people who have lingering effects, heart damage, and other people who are asymptomatic can be spreaders.
Yeah, if you think about this for a minute, common sense kicks in, but it's hard to believe they're making these arguments here and across the country. Tell us more about this group, Youth Will, and the work they're doing locally.
So Youth Will is a group that's been around for some time under a couple of different names, but really what they've been trying to do since the beginning of the pandemic is to get young people, these youth ambassadors, to reach out to other young people and ask them what they need, because we really don't have a ton of outreach from the 16 to 25-year-old age demographic, be it housing, food, information, jobs, because, basically if a lot of these people had summer jobs, they've been totally wiped out. The retail industry has been wiped out. So really reaching out to these people, identifying their needs, and then advocating on their behalf has been a big part of what this group has been doing. It's been pretty admirable work.
And the trend of COVID-19 infections, it's been shifting. First, it was older medically compromised people. That's still the case. But now we're seeing more and more people under 30 test positive, right?
Yeah, that's the main vector right now in San Diego County. And that a lot has to do with the lockdown worked for the first couple of months. But as things reopened, people went back out. And of course, all you need to do is go to the beach or any of these restaurants or bars. And, even though they're nominally outside because they've opened up a few windows and have, patio seating, people are on top of each other and talking to one another. It's tough to change behavior on such a quick, on such a dime here.
And what's coming up on the radar? Anything else you're following, stories you're working on related to COVID-19 that we'll look for in the days ahead?
Yeah, I mean, basically we're all very focused on the second wave of the pandemic, but really we're going to begin seeing the first wave of kind of the economic collapse here, because people's reserves are pretty much finished. Rent is going to come due. And without that extended unemployment, I don't know what people are going to do. Municipalities are basically out of money. States themselves can't print cash. The only place that could print cash and just kind of refill these coffers is the federal government. And they've shown that at this point, they're not interested in moving on that front. So I would say basically the economic impacts of COVID-19 are beginning to get set in stone, unfortunately. And we're going to see a lot more kind of negative health impacts on top of that, because if you're dealing with a pandemic, but then also an economic collapse, you're going to see a lot more essentially illnesses of despair. It's dark, but it does kind of call for bold action from the government right now.
Right. A lot of these stopgap measures are like Novocaine at the dentist. They don't kill pain, they just delay it. And we may be seeing that pain coming here around the corner.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Well, I've been speaking with Max Rivlin-Nadler, reporter for KPBS News. Thank you, Max.
Thank you.
Now on The Finest. In San Diego and beyond, Our Lady of Guadalupe has morphed in meaning and form over the past 500 years.
She can be a source of comfort. She can be a source of pain. Her power comes because she has all of these different facets to her.
Listen now wherever you get your podcasts.
COVID-19 has disrupted daily life unlike anything we've seen. The threat to our personal and economic health is serious and rightfully has our attention. But there's another threat that hasn't let up. And while a lot of people have put climate change on the back burner, those with deep pockets have not. Joining us to talk about climate change and those pushing for action despite the pandemic is Michael Smolens, columnist for the San Diego Union-Tribune. Hi, Michael.
Mark, how are you doing?
Well as everybody in this pandemic age. I wanted to start by asking about your column. This is a topic of overriding importance, and it's been sidelined in recent months, as you point out. And your column tells us how concerns have moved beyond science journals and environmental groups. Who are some of the business interests now demanding action?
Well, as you say, just a little preamble, the timing isn't opportune, but we do have another existential crisis that we're facing, and it's climate change. This was a group of some 40 investment firms, pension funds, and other Wall Street, organizations that are invested in Wall Street. It was on the letterhead of an organization called the Ceres Financial Network. That's a nonprofit sustainability company, so they're interested in this issue. So that's what they sent this letter to the Federal Reserve Chairman and other regulatory agencies, calling on for some action, because they're fearful that climate change will have a really bad effect on the markets and they could collapse.
And they're also asking the Federal Reserve to get involved on the issue. What could the Fed actually do to help matters?
Well, the primary thing, there's many things, but the key thing is basically they want to require certain disclosures or risk factors. What they're calling on is for companies to report what their greenhouse gas emission situations are, where their facilities are that might be threatened by climate change. Typically, the key one is, along coastal areas that might be flooded, really in the not too distant future, wildfire areas and so forth, because their concern is that these companies that are increasingly at risk, for surviving basically because of climate change and may be affected. If investors aren't aware, that could really kill these loans that are out there, and just a lot of domino effect would take place in the economy and the markets. So the bottom line is that they're hoping with this information becoming public that it would also convince these companies that do have these climate change risks to change their ways and to start taking action. That would make them more attractive to getting loans.
Yeah, I'm thinking of some oil company interests in the Middle East, for example. I was just reading about record heat in Baghdad, 125 degrees. It's over 120 throughout the Middle East. Lots of American oil interests there. Now, much of the narrative on climate change, especially from those opposing new regulations, is that any drastic action could hurt the economy. But your column kind of flips that script. Those speaking up now say doing nothing will be even worse when it comes to economic interests, right?
That's what really caught my interest. Unfortunately, the news has been so bad out of the scientific community, I think people have become sort of immune to it. But yes, when the narrative is, well, it's battling climate change versus the economy. Here you have people that are deeply involved in business, that is their business, in the financial institutions, saying, if we don't do something, that's going to hurt the economy. So, they're trying to shift investment towards sustainable companies. And even those that didn't sign this, like Morgan Stanley, have been for some time making recommendations about what kind of investments for the long term should be considered in context of climate change.
Right. And of course, they're talking about a terrible a season for hurricanes and storms. We've already seen some tropical storms and some great rainfall in Texas here, all connected to climate change. I want to talk about public opinion, because this was seen for a lot of years. Politicians couldn't get excited because it wasn't that sexy an issue for the public. But how has public opinion shifted on climate change and the need for action? What does recent polling say?
Well, the polling shows that 3/4 of the people believe that action needs to be taken, that climate change is real and going to have devastating effects. The numbers drop, frankly, when you talk about, will acting on climate change help or hurt the economy? And still, even a lot of Democrats are uncertain about whether there would be a negative economic impact if government really shifts and starts attacking climate change. There's fear that it will hurt the economy. The needle has been moving towards more convincing. I don't think that dynamic has changed as to whether it's real or whether it's worth fighting, frankly.
And of course, got the most important poll coming up in November. How critical is this issue going to be as we heat up in whatever form this campaign takes, that is climate?
We've learned that we're just a little less than 100 days from the election. That's going to be a lifetime in what changes here, as we've seen from the whole COVID pandemic. The coronavirus pandemic and outbreak, that's really going to be driving things. This kind of news is really sort of back page stuff still, as vital as it is. But I think cumulatively that Trump is either in a denial or doesn't care about this. Biden has incorporated, some green elements to his economic plan. In fact, a lot of his job creation is focused on sustainable jobs in the clean energy industry.
And we'll keep an eye on that and be talking with you throughout the weeks to come here. It's amazing how fast it's moving up on us. Well, I've been speaking with Michael Smolens, columnist for the San Diego Union-Tribune. Thanks for being with us today, Michael.
Thanks for having me on.
Whether you're a baby boomer, Generation X, or millennial, you didn't have to grow up in a time like this. A tech revolution, climate change, sky-high rents, political chaos, and now a pandemic are all defining characteristics for the latest generation coming of age, Gen Z. And now the San Diego Union-Tribune is sharing their experiences and voices in a new podcast series, Hello, Gen Z. Joining us are co-hosts Christy Totten and Abby Hamblin. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Well, let's start with Christy. First, define Gen Z. Who are these young people? They're more diverse and better educated than any to come before, right?
Yeah, so one of the defining things about Gen Z is their racial and ethnic diversity. Gen Z is 48% non-white. That's higher than we've seen in any previous generation. They are on track to be the most educated. In addition to that, they're digital natives. They were born in 1997 and after. If you remember, the smartphone was invented in 2007. So they've truly, really never known life without sort of a computer in their pocket. And they're also, pretty progressive and active. We've already seen a lot from them in the news, protesting and just creating change.
And Christy, you're an opinion editor, producer for the UT. Why is this an important project for you?
I think like we said, they've been in the news so much. So when you think of Gen Z, Malala, Simone Biles, Greta Thunberg, these are all, kids born in 1997 or after that are already making a big impact. They're doing things differently. And we just thought we would get to know them and get some better insight.
And Abby, you're also part of the Union-Tribune's editorial board. Your team spent more than a year prepping for this rollout of the podcast. Why did the UT feel it was important to devote so much time and energy into these stories?
Yeah, so I think this project is a really good combination of two things. One, it wasn't just recently that we've been having these big national conversations about race and equity and those issues, but we also want to make an effort to really include young people in the news. Christy and I are both millennials. I think we find it really important to have that millennial perspective represented in what we see in the news. And so it's the next generation's turn. They're entering the workforce. They're starting to have a vote in politics in their first election. Some even voted in 2018. And I think it's just a really good time to sort of pass them the mic and hear what they have to say about these things and how they want to make an impact.
So we have a clip from one of your episodes. It touches on the misconceptions of Gen Z, and we'll get you to respond on the other side. Here's that clip.
You may have heard some of the cliches and stereotypes about Generation Z, and you may even believe them. The young Americans who make up this generation, those born in 1997 or after, are aware of what you might think of them.
The main misconception is probably that we are bound to our devices and that we mindlessly follow woke culture without fully interrogating those issues.
People look at us like we're very young and very stupid and childish, and that we're very oblivious to things.
They like to confuse us for millennials. I feel like they have a strong negative opinion of millennials, and then they try to represent it.
These are some of the things you're going to hear from Gen Z as they explain who they really are. On this episode, we're going to take a deep dive into one of Generation Z's defining characteristics. They're the most racially and ethnically diverse generation in U.S. history.
So, Abby, any other misconceptions out there?
So, yeah, that was one of the favorite things that they loved when we talked to them to speak on is, what do people get wrong about us? And I think that connectivity one is probably the biggest one, but it's multifaceted. So while they have grown up with smartphones and you may think that they're very connected and social in that way, we actually have an op-ed in the Union Tribune right now from a young writer who says that, just because we seem so connected doesn't mean we don't have problems with loneliness and mental health stemming from social media. So while they look like they're on their phones all the time, that doesn't mean that the phones are always making them happy or that they're, enjoying that time. I think also with politics, on this podcast, you're going to hear from, of course, liberal members of Gen Z, and they're kind of known for being progressive, but we also talk to some conservative members of Gen Z. And so I think that's going to be really interesting for people to hear. You can't, we tend to paint these generations with a broad brush, but they're all very different in the same way that millennials have had different experiences, and that goes for other generations. So it's really for them to voice that, and that's what we've been trying to do, is really let them speak for themselves.
And Christy, in the first full episode, you get into the election and how a diverse field ended up being another choice between two old white men. You also asked what they want in a leader. What did you learn?
One of the people we talked to, Allison Aiken, she's the one that's quoted in our first episode. She's the president of the College Democrats at SDSU. And she had a pretty bold answer. She said, I think she wanted a Black trans president. But then she went on to explain the reason being she just wanted somebody that's had a lot of difficult experiences that could relate to her generation. This generation, we're all going through the pandemic now. We're going through another recession. They went through the last one as well. They've just kind of had a tough go already. They feel like they're being left with this destroyed planet. They really feel this. And so from her, she wanted somebody that could also understand those problems. But, it was also interesting, the candidates were typically kind of old. She liked Bernie Sanders. I mean, he's from the silent generation. He's nowhere near her. Yeah, in age. But she felt like of all the candidates, he could best relate to Gen Z.
And Christy, utilizing social media as a form of Gen Z's activism, and one episode has an example of a makeup tutorial on TikTok raising the issue of human rights abuses in China. The rise of television was a key part of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Might we be seeing a similar trend today with social media and Gen Z?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're already seeing it. We interviewed young people who have planned protests overnight over social media. They're sharing tips on how to protest on social media. Again, they're just complete digital natives who are so quick and so effortless at doing this and feel completely comfortable. But, they're not just using social media to post selfies and share frivolous information. They're really doing it to create a change. And we've seen that already.
And Abby, Hello Gen Z already has a few episodes available. It's not just politics, race, and activism. What else do you hope to explore with the podcast?
Yeah, so I think Gen Z, one of the big things that they really like to speak on, and then you can't really avoid, is mental health. So we're going to look at that for a little bit. I think social media plays a big role there. And then we're also going to get into kind of this idea of identity. A lot of where Gen Z comes from is how they sort of cultivate their identity online and through what they see in the news and with all the information they consume on social media, but also who they are. They come from families of immigrants. They come from all different kinds of experiences that maybe boomers didn't have, or Gen X. And so, they're really going to speak to who they are as a generation. And we're really excited to share that.
Yeah, I found it interesting. You noted early on that the folks under 16, I believe, are already a majority diverse as opposed to the white population majority of all of us who are older.
Yeah, it just so happened, we've been working on this project for a while, but that news came out from the census. And I think it really speaks to, we have one expert from the Brookings Institution on this podcast who wrote a book called Diversity Explosion. And on our latest episode, we really look at that and, what it means and how it feels for those young people to be sort of dealing in real time with, being such a diverse generation and how that sort of impacts how they're going about their lives. So definitely interesting.
And Christy, we make the point that Gen Z gets news from social media, basically. Are you trying to change that by featuring all the coverage of this generation in the dinosaur medium, a newspaper, or are the Gen Z stories in the UT aimed at all the other generations? I just find it kind of ironic.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So, when we made the podcast, we realized we wanted it to be for everybody, for older generations to help learn about Gen Z, but also we wanted Gen Z to feel reflected. I don't selling Gen Z any newspaper subscriptions with this podcast, but we're going to social media, hopefully to connect with them there. But yeah, that is pretty funny.
And Christy, please remind us, let everybody know how we can follow the podcast when new episodes post, where to find it.
Sure. I think the easiest thing to do would be to go to uniontrib.com/hello Gen Z. You can actually find the episodes and play them there on the page, or you can also find a link to subscribe on your favorite platform, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, any of them.
And while you're on the Union Trib website, you can take a look at the stories you've done so far and the voices there in print, which I hate to betraying my age and my long career in newspapers. That's where I see most of this stuff still. I've been speaking with Abby Hamlin and Christy Totten, co-host of Hello Gen Z, a new podcast series from the San Diego Union Tribune. Thanks to you both for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
That wraps up another week of stories on the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Michael Smolens of the San Diego Union Tribune, Max Rivlin-Nadler of KPBS News, and podcast hosts Abby Hamlin and Christy Totten, also of the Union Tribune. If you ever miss a show, you can catch up on the Roundtable podcast, available on your favorite podcast app. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for being with us today, and join us again next week on the Roundtable.
Now on The Finest, we examine an icon. Our Lady of Guadalupe has been a powerful symbol for 500 years, and artists have reimagined her as a source of resilience and pride. Listen now wherever you get your podcasts.